Today we will be discussing the Sultanate period with particular emphasis on the economy and society in North India. We will start with the environmental context. The evidences are few and far between. But then also we find the environment was very important even in the context of the Sultanate. In the northern India, particularly, we find two river systems dominating the whole expanse of the North Indian plains. One on the western side, it is the Indus River system, whereas on the eastern side, it was the Gangetic plains, and these two dominated the life, with the precipitation, rainfall concentrated on the eastern part, and that's why the population was also much more dense in the eastern part of India. The eastern part, the river course, it is very treacherous. It changes its course several times and with disastrous effects on the life of common people. But even in the western side also, we find evidences of the shifting of river courses, and this we find in the Indus River system. Or take for instance the case of Yamuna, which in the 7th 8th century watered a small watercourse in Haryana which was known as Chitang, but later it shifted, and because of this shift Chitang became dry, which resulted in desiccation of Haryana.
Excuse me, sir, how did these environmental changes affect the economy?
With this desiccation of Haryana, the agricultural economy obviously was affected. It became totally dependent on rainfall, and only one crop, that is the Kharif, was possible. And it was during the reign of Firoz Tughlaq that he built up a network of canals which ultimately again made Haryana agriculturally very much productive. And as a result of this change introduced by Firoz Tughlaq, we find that not only Kharif but even the Rabi crop was then possible in Haryana. So in this context we find the river playing a very significant role. After the river, we can discuss about the importance of forests on the life of common people. In North India, nowadays you won't find a single outcrop of forests, but in the Sultanate period, as we find in the texts, several very dense pockets of forests were there in the Doab region. When there was the tax increase done by Muhammad bin Tughlaq, there we find that people rose up in revolt. And the rebellious peasants, they took refuge in those forests. It also produced important things like lac, honey, or even wild varieties of silk. And also it gave sustenance to those people who depended on food gathering economy. With the expansion of human habitation, these forest covers, along with the wild animals which ran through these forests, it totally vanished. With the environmental thing over, then we take up the case of agricultural production, where we find very important technological innovations coming, if not along with the Ghorian raiders, some just a few years before that, or even after that. And they were very important, like artificial irrigation. You will consider that it was very important for proliferation of agriculture. And in northern India, the well irrigation was important. India in the ancient period knew about a mechanism which was known as orghatto, which means a kind of pot garland which was placed on the rim of a wheel. Later it was renamed as Noria. It was worked by the human labor. But in this period, we find a definite change taking place where the vertical wheel was tied with a drawbar where the animals were fixed, and with the help of a pin drum gearing, it went on continuously drawing water from the wells. And this, the prototype of the metallic Persian wheel which proliferated during the Mughal period, we find the agricultural productivity increasing, particularly in the Indus region. So this is a very important technological change directly related with agriculture. But there are some other changes which was taking place. Like, I will give you one example: sericulture, that is the cultivation of mulberry and then producing silk. This was almost unknown to India. Earlier, the technique, it evolved in China in the earlier parts of the common Christian era. But later, very slowly, it diffused through Khotan, and possibly with the hands of these Turkish raiders, it came to India. One can say that silk was available in India. Colhan gives some narration of this thing. But it is also possible that either the Chinese silk was directly imported, like the word Chinangshuk. It means the Chinese muslin coming to India, or the raw silk was imported from China. During the period of Ibn Battuta, who came during the reign of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, while traveling Bengal, he couldn't find muslin or silk. But later, when a Chinese navigator, Ma Huan, he came to Bengal, he found that already mulberry production has started. So you can see that the silk production or the sericulture as such, it takes place or it starts with the Sultanate or just after that. Then, for instance, preparation of indigo vats, waterproof cementing technology using gypsum, it came with Sultanate. Another thing, the technology of distillation. Earlier there was a kind of distillation available in India, which we find in the archaeological remains of Gandhar, known as the Gandhar stills. But the West Asian stills, headed with, which was known as Moore's head, it was much superior. The technology of cooling was much superior compared to Gandhar stills. And with this, the distillation of fermented sugar syrup, it starts with this period. And in Delhi, in and around Delhi, we find the distilleries, they are proliferating. The reference of charkha, the earliest example we find in Isami in his Futuh us Salatin. Earlier it was hand spinning through spindle. Now it was the spinning wheel which has been introduced, and this increased the effectiveness of the spinner almost 6 times, it is said. So it increased production of cotton yarn. Then cotton carders bow, this was introduced possibly earlier, but much proliferation in this period. And obviously the weaver's loom also started in this period. So with these technological innovations or changes coming into India, India became a major textile producing country. This agro industries, it gathered momentum with these kind of technological changes.
The Delhi Sultanate constitutes an important phase in the Indian history for its geographical expanse as well as centralization of political power and economic resources. The rivers played an important role in agriculture, while the forests provided resources and refuge to the peasants. Sericulture, or rearing of mulberry silkworms, evolved into an important economic activity during the Sultanate.
With these technological changes, we take up the issue of rural society. That is also very important, because in this period we find some very important changes were taking place as we started with centralization of power.
What was the role of the state during that time?
It was basically divided into some rural aristocracy, Rai, Rana, and their cavalrymen who were known as Rawats, which is derived from the word Rajaputra. Now, they were ruling the roost. Now, with the infiltration of the Turkish cavalry and building up of the Delhi Sultanate, first we find that these people, when they were defeated, they were kept in their place. These Rais, Ranas, Rawats, they were not totally displaced, they were kept in their place, and the state tried to extract tributes from them. This was first the role of the state. But starting from Alauddin Khilji onwards, we find state trying to get into this rural structure, rural society, rural power structure, and placing it above these Rais, Ranas, Rawats. Generally speaking, Delhi Sultanate was, in the earlier days, in the inception, it was basically a garrison sort of state, confined within several cities, and the rest of the country it was rebellious, Mawas. Punitive actions were sent and tried to extract as much as tribute as possible. But later, these Ranas, Rawats, they were being decimated, and a new power structure came into being, who were known as later Chaudhuris. First reference we find in the writings of Ibn Battuta, who calls them Jautari, who rules over some 100 villages, Sadi, Battuta says. Whether it was 100 villages or not, we don't know. There are some, you can say, numerical divisions known as Chaurasis, 84 villages. But we don't know whether it was 100 or not. Later, the basic revenue unit above the village was Pargana, which was headed by the Chaudhuris. Chaudhuris, you can say, were drawn some part from the old structure, Rais, Ranas, Rawats. Some part it was a sort of evolution which took place during this Delhi Sultanate period. And another thing was the earlier structure, who was known as Khuds and Muqaddams. Muqaddams, even in 20th century we find the reference. But the Khuds, along with the Muqaddams, they were basically the revenue drawing authority from the village, who, it is said, that were exempted from payment of the 4 major taxes introduced by Alauddin Khilji: the land tax, Kharaj or Jizya, then Chadai, the grazing tax, and the holding tax known as Ghadi. And along with this, they were drawing some tributes from the villagers, customary dues they were drawing. With this, they were very formidable, and it is said that Alauddin Khilji wanted to decimate this group and started imposing pressure on them, which you can say a kind of instance of the centralization that I am talking about. Later, along with several other groups known as Maliks, Mafrozis, they constituted a group over and above the toiling peasants, the village menials, balahars. On the top of them, there was a structure who were generally known or denoted with the generic term zamindar. So state had a particular role, very important role, in controlling or in evolution of this group. So this is the role of the state. Another very important thing which Delhi Sultanate introduced was a very heavy incidence of land tax, which was known as Kharaj o Mal. The main tax during the Sultanate introduced by Alauddin Khalji was Kharaj, which they inherited from the Ghaznavid or the Ghurid predecessors. But this, they, at least during Alauddin Khalji's period, we find was imposed after measurement and a kind of estimate about, a possible estimate about the yield. It was very heavy because almost 50% of the agricultural surplus was drawn from the villages. And another very important aspect was Ikta. Ikta means a kind of transferable revenue assignment. It can be transferred, given to, assigned to the military commanders. Now, the military commanders then could sub-assign Iktas to their troopers. So this was the general structure. There was Ikta, which was given to the military commanders, known as Muktis or Walis, and rest, a sizable section, was kept for the crown land, which was known as Khalisa. Now, the Khalisa was meant for emperor, who drew Kharaj o Mal from that portion and used either for maintenance of his establishment, a huge establishment as you know, along with maintenance of a standing imperial army, which was known as Hashmi Kalb. So this was the general position. Now we will take up another very important thing, that is, you know that Alauddin Khalji introduced with a kind of market control, controlling the prices. Some say that this is not possible, it was a figment of imagination that Barani states. But nowadays, the new researchers, it shows that with this heavy tax, land tax, and possibly it was gathered either in cash or partly in kind. When this was imposed, the peasants were forced to part with their produce, which was then purchased by a kind of itinerant merchants known as Karwani. It is said, Barani states, that Alauddin Khalji forced these Karwanis then to sell this grain which they have collected from the peasants to the state or to the main cities. And with the glut of agricultural products, suddenly the price would have come down. So what Barani was describing possibly was true, at least in the major cities. And this is a very important aspect of the Sultanate economy, particularly in the rural area. The Sultanate has been heavily implicated. They are totally dependent on this huge income. If the country becomes desolate, as happened in the case of Sultanate, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the economy of the Sultanate will be affected. So, along with this pressure, now they started taking interest in expansion of agriculture also. And that's why we find that Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who was the main, you can say, quote-unquote culprit of imposing very heavy tax in Doab or increasing the tax in Doab, he, when he realized that the agriculture is going desolate or becoming desolate, he started a total new ministry, Amir-e-Kohi, which was entrusted with expansion of agriculture. And loans were given, which was known as takafi, to the people, to the peasants.
How did India react to all the changes that had taken place?
Number one, you find that India is, or was earlier, or even nowadays, it is a caste-ridden society, where it means that the occupation of the father will be taken by the son. Now, you can very well put the question, as you have put, that with these new technological changes, as I have talked, with this new situation which was coming into being, how India or how the rural society it responded. The general response would have been either rejecting the changes fully and getting into the cocoon. But the state wanted these changes, or it needed labor who will be conversant with these new technology. And there we find a very regressive social custom playing a very significant role, that is slavery. In the early days of Sultanate, we find all major campaigns, it resulted in a huge war captives who were then sold in the markets as labor, slaves. And for instance, Alauddin Khalji, we find that he had some 50,000 slaves. Take for instance Firoz Tughlaq. He had some 1,80,000 slaves, of which some 12,000 were artisans. And as they were slaves, as they didn't have the personal freedom to reject, they were forced to take up these new technologies. And thus we find that the Sultanate economy, Sultanate period, it constitutes a very important period for change. And there I will come to the last portion, that is assessment. How we will assess this Sultanate. Here we find that there are several viewpoints. For instance, Didi Koshambi, he lauds role of these Islamic raiders, who he finds broke down the hidebound system of the caste-ridden society. But for instance, K.S. Lal, Lallanji Gopal, they don't find the role of the Sultanate was so positive. They actually find that it starts declining during the Sultanate. A very important historian, Professor Muhammad Habib, he was very much aware about the destructive role of this Sultanate warfare, the destruction that they meted on thousands and thousands of people. But there he find, or he looks into this aspect, or assessing the role of Sultanate from a totally new perspective. He sees that earlier the artisan class, who were considered to be the untouchables or not so lauded position, these artisans, along with this Turks, they started entering into the confines of the city. And this he considers to be a case of quote-unquote urban revolution. He considers this to be a social revolution where the artisans, they played significant role under the leadership of the Turks. And he considers this to be a libertarian experience. Those people who were considered to be the outcasts, now they are trying to assert themselves. But as I told you, that the proliferation of slave labor, it belies the position of Muhammad Habib that it was very libertarian. Rather it was regressive. But in the end result, we find that this changes, though it was based on slave labor, it had a very significant future role for the Indian economy. Another thing, the very important, though I won't say very productive, debate on the role, whether it was Oriental despotism or it was some other kind of social formation. Some of the aspects, it goes along with the Oriental despot thing. The incidence of tax, very heavy tax put on the agriculturalists, peasants, which makes the tax and the rent equivalent. Here, though the state is taking tax, it is so heavy that it is almost equivalent to rent. So it is a kind of tax rent equivalence. And because of this, state takes tremendous interest in the well-being of agriculture. As we find that loans are being given Takavi, or network of canals are being dug for proliferation of agriculture. So state takes interest, which one can say that goes along with the depiction of the Oriental despot, that though he is very strict, but he caters for the good of agriculture for his own interest, self-interest, but nevertheless good for the society also. But it was a very sprawling economy. Precious metals were being India for a long time didn't see so much proliferation of metal economy and monetization. This goes against the position of Oriental despotism. So we can say that Sultanate was a kind of entity of its own, but very important in the context of the Indian economy, Indian history of Indian economy, because it played a very positive role in some of the aspects, if not all.
The Delhi Sultanate constitutes an important phase in the Indian history for its geographical expanse as well as centralization of political power and economic resources. The rivers played an important role in agriculture, while the forests provided resources and refuge to the peasants. Sericulture, or rearing of mulberry silkworms, evolved into an important economic activity during the Sultanate. The change in the rural power structure decimated the traditionally powerful local satraps like the Rayas, Ranas and Rawats. The Rayas, Ranas and Rawats were slowly superseded by a new class of rural intermediaries, the Chaudhuris. The heavy incidence of the land tax known as Kharaj o Mal became a new feature during the Sultanate. The role of the slaves was important to cope with application of technology for increased production.